tonight we find ourselves not under a cozy duvet of stars, but standing ankle-deep in the warm, red earth of a field somewhere in the Gangetic Plains, around 300 BCE. The air isn't moving. It hangs around you, thick and heavy as a woolen blanket, pressing the scent of dried hay and distant, damp soil into your lungs. You are a farmer, or perhaps a village elder, and your entire world, the green shoots in the field, the fullness of the grain stores, the very lives of your family and livestock, hums with a single, silent, desperate question. When you squint at the sky, a vast, bleached blue bowl that has offered nothing but relentless sun for weeks. Your survival, quite frankly, hinges on a massive, chaotic, and spectacularly unreliable weather system known as the monsoon. You are about to learn that waiting for it, and understanding it, will become a national project of meticulous patience. The project begins not with grand philosophy, but with something laughably simple, a pot. A pot buried in the ground. You probably won't survive this season if the pot stays empty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tension in the air isn't just psychological, it's a physical weight. You can taste the dust on your tongue, a fine grit that coats everything. In the distance, children are unusually quiet, their play subdued by the heat. The cattle low listlessly. This is the pre-monsoon period, a time of strained stillness where every communal conversation, every glance exchanged between neighbors, is a silent negotiation of hope and fear. Your life is dictated by Ritu, the season, and you are stuck in the grueling Grishma, the summer season, waiting for the salvation of Vashal, the rains. It's in this context of existential suspense that you make a daily pilgrimage. Not to a temple, but to a specific spot in a cleared field. There, set into the earth, is a large, unglazed earthen pot. Its mouth is level with the ground. This, in its breathtaking simplicity, is one of humanity's first known standardized rain gauges. It's called a vashamana, literally, rain measure. The concept is so straightforward a child could grasp it. Rainwater falls, collects in the pot, and someone measures the depth of the water inside. The genius isn't in the pot itself, but in the system surrounding it. This isn't one farmer's quirky hobby. This is, as you'll come to see, an early form of state-sponsored data collection. The fact that ancient Indian civilizations developed systematic methods to measure rainfall is widely accepted by historians and meteorologists alike, a testament to their advanced understanding of agrarian economies. You kneel by the pot, its rough clay warm under your fingertips. You peer inside. It's bone dry, save for a few despairing ants scrambling at the bottom. You sigh, a sound lost in the heavy air. The wait continues. But this act of checking, this daily ritual of observation, transforms the passive agony of waiting into an active, if tiny, form of participation. You are not just a victim of the weather, you are its recorder. Your village, and countless others like it, are becoming data points in a vast, subcontinental experiment to understand the rhythm of the skies. It's a humble beginning, a single note in a symphony of patience that will take centuries to compose. And as you rise, dusting the red earth from your knees, you might not yet know that this simple pot is mentioned in one of the world's oldest surviving manuals on statecraft, a book so ruthless in its political advice it makes most modern campaign strategies look like polite suggestions. But that's a discovery for another evening. For now, you simply listen to the silence, broken only by the buzz of a lone, stubborn bee, and wait. Your walk back from the empty rain gauge feels longer today, the path home more rutted, the shade from the few hardy trees less comforting. The pot's dryness is a physical verdict, a silent announcement that the waiting game is still in play. But this isn't a lonely vigil. In every village across this Magadhan territory, Someone just like you is performing the same ritual, peering into the same type of pot, feeling the same mix of resignation and stubborn hope. This collective glance into clay vessels is the foundation of something much larger. We're moving from the field to the administrative mind, from the earthy pot to the parchment scroll. The story of the rain gauge is about to get bureaucratic and surprisingly sophisticated. Let's pull the camera back, high above your village, soaring over the patchwork of fields and mud-brick dwellings, following a dusty road that leads to a regional administrative center. The air here smells different, less of hay and soil, more of incense, sandalwood, and the faint, sharp scent of penned animals. You are no longer the farmer. You are a GOP, a village headman or record keeper, and you carry with you a small, carefully sealed clay tablet. On it, etched in neat Brahmi script, is the weekly report. It lists the number of cattle, the status of the granaries, any disputes settled, and the depth of water in the village's Vashamana. 0, again. You hand this tablet to a clerk in a shaded courtyard, who notes its arrival on a larger ledger. Your single data point, your village's 0, is about to join hundreds of others. This systematic collection of data wasn't born from pure scientific curiosity, though that was part of it. It was born from a very practical, somewhat cynical, and universally constant need: taxation. The state's treasury, its ability to fund armies, build infrastructure, and pay its vast administration, was directly tied to the harvest. And the harvest was directly tied to the rain. Therefore, predicting, measuring, and accounting for rainfall became a primary fiscal activity. The state needed to know not just if a region had a bad year, but how bad, so it could adjust land revenue demands accordingly. It was a brutal form of agricultural insurance, where the premium was your data. Historians still argue whether this system was primarily a tool for empathetic state relief during droughts or a ruthless mechanism for maximizing sustainable revenue extraction. The truth, as it often is in history, likely lay in an uncomfortable middle ground, depending entirely on the character of the local official. Now, imagine the room where your little tablet's data ends up. It's a scriptorium of sorts, cool and quiet, with scribes cross-legged on mats, their styli scratching against palm leaves or prepared birch bark. They are compiling reports from dozens of villages. One scribe's job might be solely dedicated to rainfall figures. He transfers the numbers from your tablet onto a large regional sheet, creating what we'd now call a dataset. He notices that the villages in the Eastern District have reported a few angulars, finger widths, of rain, while the Western ones, like yours, report none. This isn't just record keeping, it's the birth of comparative meteorology. They are beginning to see patterns, to understand that rain doesn't bless or curse a kingdom uniformly, but falls in patches and bands. This office, with its rustling leaves and muttered numbers, is a silent nerve center, its purpose to translate the mystery of the sky into columns of actionable arithmetic. And the manual that likely guided much of this work, from the design of the pot to the use of its data, was waiting in a library not far away, its advice as sharp and clear as a scribe's stylus. That compiled sheet of rainfall data, with its sobering columns of zeros and its occasional, hopeful digits, doesn't just sit in a dusty archive. It feeds a mind, or rather, the collective mind of the state, which in this era is being rigorously instructed by a singular, seminal text. We must now leave the scriptorium and its scratching styli behind and step into the conceptual world of the Arthashastra. Don't let the Sanskrit name intimidate you. Think of it as the ultimate, no-nonsense guide to running a kingdom, written by a man named Kautilya, also known as Chanakya. He was the prime minister to the first Mauryan emperor, Chandragupta, and his book is less a philosophical treatise and more a meticulous, sometimes chilling, manual on political survival. It covers everything from spy networks and economic policy to the proper dosage of poison. And nestled among its 15 books, right there between chapters on mining and minting coins, is a direct, bureaucratic mention of your rain gauge. You are now in a quiet study, the air smelling of lamp oil and treated palm leaf. A scholar official, perhaps an amateur or advisor, unrolls a section of the Arthashastra. His finger traces the lines as he reviews a directive. The text instructs the Superintendent of Agriculture, a specific, salaried government position, which is itself a fascinating detail, on his duties. And it states, with typical efficiency, that one of his key responsibilities is to record the quantity of rain that falls in the country. It even specifies the unit of measurement, the drona. Now, a drona was a volumetric measure, roughly equivalent to a bucketful, used for grain and liquids. This tells us something vital. The measurement wasn't just qualitative, a little or a lot. It was quantitative. The state demanded a number. The Arthashastra is, in fact, the world's first known written work to explicitly mention the use of a standardized rain gauge for administrative purposes. That's the widely accepted historical fact that elevates your simple village pot to an instrument of statecraft. But the Arthashastra's genius, and its dry humor, lies in its granularity. It doesn't just say measure the rain. It shows a profound understanding of microclimates. The text advises that rainfall should be measured in the Janapada, the countryside, as distinct from the fortified city. Think about that. Kautilya, or the tradition he compiled, understood that rainfall could differ between open fields and the urban heat island of a city. He was cautioning against using data from one to judge the other. This level of environmental nuance in a 2,300-year-old political manual is the kind of surprising detail that makes you pause and appreciate the sheer observational prowess of these ancient scientists. They weren't just bureaucrats, they were proto-ecologists. And here's where we touch on a gentle scholarly debate. While the Arthashastra is definitively attributed to Kautilya of the 4th century BCE, some historians still argue whether the text we have today is a single-authored work from that period or a compilation that was refined and added to over subsequent centuries, like a revered Wikipedia page locked in palm leaf. This matters for our rain gauge because it asks, was this systematic measurement a fully-formed idea at the dawn of the Mauryan Empire, or did it evolve and become codified later? Either way, the directive stands, clear and practical, in the version that has come down to us. It links the king's power directly to the water in your village pot, creating a tangible, measurable chain of cause and effect from the clouds to the royal treasury. The advisor rolls the scroll shut, his mind already turning the reported zeros into calculations for grain reserves and potential tax relief. The wait for rain is no longer just an agricultural concern. It is a matter of state security, governed by the cool, calculating logic of the Arthashastra. The directive from the Arthashastra is not a suggestion. It's a command that echoes down the chain of administration, transforming abstract policy into daily routine. So let's follow that command back to where the data is born. You are no longer the advisor in the quiet study. You are, once more, at the local level. But this time, you are the official in charge. You are the Sityaka, the superintendent of agriculture himself, or more likely, one of his many deputies stationed in a provincial town. Your office is a practical space. Wattle and daub walls, a roof of thatch, a large wooden table stained with ink and the rings of countless clay cups. The air here is a mix of dust, papyrus, and the faint, sweet smell of the mango grove outside your window. This is where the theoretical meets the mud-spattered real. On your table lies the core tool of your trade, the ledger. It's not a single book, but a series of tied-together palm leaves or a scroll of cloth paper, filled with grids and columns. One major section is dedicated to Vashalika, rainfall accounts. As reports trickle in from village headmen, your clerks enter the numbers. But you're not just a passive collector. Your job, as per the manual, is to interpret. You compare this week's numbers to last week's, and to the numbers from the same period last year, if those records are available. You are looking for a trend, a pattern in the dryness. A single zero is concern, a column of zeros is a crisis in its infancy. You have the authority to draft a preliminary report to the Central Treasury, suggesting a preparatory hold on grain shipments from royal storehouses, or a temporary halt on the collection of the barga, the share of the produce owed as tax. This is the machinery of patience in action. The state, through you, is institutionalizing the act of waiting. It's replacing the farmer's agonized, helpless gaze at the sky with a structured, data-informed vigil. You authorize the distribution of seed from state granaries for a second, desperate sowing if a certain number of days pass without a recorded angular of rain. You might even, following the Arthashastra's famously detailed guidance on everything, recommend the performance of specific rituals to appease the rain gods, not because you've abandoned data, but because you are covering all bases, spiritual and practical. The state's approach is holistic, a blend of measurement and metaphysics that seems strange to our modern dichotomy but was perfectly logical to them. The widely accepted historical fact here is the existence of this elaborate, written administrative apparatus for managing natural resources, of which the rain gauge was a critical sensor. Now for the slightly amusing, wonderfully human detail. Among your administrative duties, as hinted in various texts and commentaries, was the need to account for evaporation. That's right. A clever clerk, or perhaps a skeptical junior superintendent, must have noticed that if you measured the water in the pot immediately after a shower, you'd get one number. But if a lazy village headman waited a day under the hot sun to make his measurement, the number would be smaller. The question of time of measurement became an issue. While we have no evidence of strict hourly mandates, the concern itself speaks volumes. They were aiming for precision, or at least for consistency, understanding that even their simple tool had variables to control. It's a humble, granular problem that any modern field scientist would instantly recognize and appreciate. Historians still argue whether this entire system was primarily proactive or reactive. Was the data from your office used to anticipate disaster and mobilize resources preemptively, or was it chiefly used to assess damage and calibrate the tax burden after the fact? The truth probably varied with the efficiency and empathy of each ruling regime. But the system's very existence created a framework. It meant that the suffering caused by drought was not just an act of God to be borne in silent despair. It was a quantified variable in the ledger of the state, something that could, in theory, be managed, mitigated, and planned for. In your quiet, dusty office, with the ledger open before you, the wait for rain becomes a shared, administrative responsibility. The anxiety is not dispelled, but it is distributed, and in that distribution, a form of resilience is born. The ledgers in your provincial office are not just lists of numbers. They are the raw material for a grander, more consequential calculation. Each angular of rainfall recorded, or, more pressingly, each empty column representing a lack of it, feeds directly into one of the most fundamental equations of the ancient state, the land revenue formula. We're about to move from data collection to applied mathematics, from the observation of nature to the structuring of society. The patience enforced by the rain gauge now translates into cold, hard economics. So let's pull back the lens to see the entire fiscal engine. Imagine the Central Revenue Ministry in the Mauryan capital of Pataliputra. It's a grander version of your provincial office, with higher ceilings, better incense, and more important-looking seals. Here, senior officials called Samahata, collectors general, pore over compiled regional reports. Their primary goal is to determine the barga, the king's share of the agricultural produce, typically reckoned as 1/6, though this could vary. But how do you calculate 1/6 of a harvest that hasn't happened yet, or that might fail entirely? You use the rain gauge data as your leading indicator. The Arthashastra and other texts outline a sophisticated system of assessment. The state didn't just take a flat percentage of whatever grew. It estimated the expected yield based on several factors: the type of soil, the crop sown, the labor invested, and the measured rainfall. This is where your village empty pot has direct, financial teeth. A region showing consistently low rainfall measurements would have its revenue demand adjusted downwards in anticipation of a poor yield. This was the state's hedge against total collapse. It was also, in a way, a form of contract. The farmer's obligation wasn't to produce an arbitrary amount of grain, but to produce what the land, under the observed conditions, could reasonably yield. The rain gauge was the impartial arbitrator in that contract. The widely accepted historical fact is that ancient Indian states, particularly the Mauryan and later the Gupta empires, operated complex, variable tax systems intimately tied to agricultural productivity, with rainfall measurement being a key input for that calculation. Now, let's add a layer of fascinating, granular detail. The assessment wasn't just about total seasonal rainfall. The timing of the rain mattered profoundly. The ancient agrarian scientists classified rains not just by quantity, but by their seasonal appropriateness. A downpour in the early sowing season was worth more than the same amount during harvest, when it could ruin the crops. Texts like the Krishiparashara and even earlier traditions speak of Mdu, gentle, Stra, moderate, and Tivra, torrential, rains, each with different effects. While your simple pot couldn't distinguish between a gentle drizzle and a cloudburst, the local officials reporting the numbers certainly would have noted the character of the rain in their qualitative remarks. A season might show adequate total angulars, but if it all fell in a few destructive storms, the tax assessment would reflect that calamity, not the deceptively comforting number. Historians still argue whether this system was applied consistently and fairly across the vast and diverse empire, or if it was an ideal model that often broke down under local corruption, distant oversight, or the sheer complexity of the task. It's one thing to have a brilliant policy in Pataliputra. It's another to have it implemented justly by a minor official 300 miles away during a drought. The potential for the rain gauge data to be fudged, by a farmer hoping to lower his tax, or by a greedy official hoping to inflate it, was a vulnerability they surely knew. Yet, the very creation of this system, this attempt to link royal revenue to a measurable, natural phenomenon, represents a monumental leap in governance. It turned the capriciousness of the monsoon from a mere disaster into a quantifiable risk, to be managed with a blend of patience, data, and economic policy. The empty pot was no longer just a symbol of despair. In the revenue ministry, it was a cell in a spreadsheet, prompting a formula that could mean the difference between sustenance and famine for an entire province. The effectiveness of the entire revenue engine, from your anxious glance into the pot to the minister's final calculation, depended on the integrity of that first, humble measurement. Which brings us to the often overlooked hero of this story, the rain gauge itself. Not just the idea of it, but the physical object. We've been calling it a simple pot, but its design and placement were matters of thoughtful, almost scientific, consideration. So let's step away from the ledgers and offices and return to the field, this time with the eye of an engineer, or what passed for one in 300 BCE. You are now the artisan, or the village elder tasked with installing the new Vashamana for the season. You don't just grab any old pot from the kitchen. The vessel has specifications. It needs to be cylindrical, or nearly so, with straight, vertical sides. Why? Because if the pot bulges in the middle or narrows at the top, the depth of the water won't have a consistent relationship to its volume. A one-angular depth in a narrow-necked pot holds far less water than a one-angular depth in a straight-sided one. They may not have articulated the mathematical principle of cross-sectional area, but they understood the need for standardization. The pot was also unglazed earthenware. This porousness was a feature, not a bug, for a reason we'll get to. Its mouth was wide, to catch as much rain as possible without splash out, and it was set into the ground so the rim was exactly level with the soil surface. This prevented wind from creating eddies that could blow rain away from or into the mouth, and it stopped ground runoff from contaminating the sample. Now, where do you place it? This is where the practical wisdom shines. You don't put it under the shade of the great banyan tree where the village council meets. You place it in a cleared, open field, away from buildings, tall trees, or hills. The goal is to measure rain falling on open agricultural land, free from obstructions. The Arthasastra's instruction to measure in the Janapada, countryside, rather than the city implies this understanding. They were creating what a modern meteorologist would call a standard exposure for their instrument. This pursuit of a consistent, representative measurement environment is the lesser-known, surprisingly sophisticated detail that turns the pot from a receptacle into an instrument. But what about that porous clay? Here's a clever bit of low-tech problem-solving. A completely impervious pot, like a glazed one or a metal vessel, would be fine for an immediate measurement. But what if the official couldn't come for a few days? Water would stagnate, algae would grow, and evaporation would still occur. The englazed earthenware pot, however, allowed for slow, consistent seepage. Some historians and ethnometeorologists suggest this seepage was actually a calibrated feature. The idea is that the natural evaporation and seepage from the porous walls would roughly balance out over a short period, preventing overflow during heavy rains and maintaining a somewhat stable level for a day or two until measurement. It acted as a primitive buffer or dampener. While it wasn't perfectly accurate by our standards, it was consistent within a known range of error, which is often more important for comparative data than perfect precision. Historians still argue whether this porousness was an intentional design feature for stabilization or simply an unavoidable characteristic of the most commonly available, cheapest material. Given the meticulousness evident in other specifications, the former is a compelling possibility. So you, the installer, carefully sink the pot into the chosen spot, using a leveled frame of wood to ensure the rim is perfectly even with the earth. You pat the soil around it, your hands feeling the gritty texture of the clay. This object, now a part of the landscape, is a silent sentinel. It doesn't just collect water, it filters out the noise of the environment. It ignores the splash from rooftops, the drip from leaves, the runoff from slopes. Its sole purpose is to capture what falls directly from the sky onto the open field. In its englazed, earthy simplicity, it embodies a profound principle. To understand a vast, chaotic system like the monsoon, you must start with a single, clean, well-defined point of data. And you must protect the integrity of that point with all the thoughtful design your civilization can muster. The individual pots, scattered like ceramic sentinels across the countryside, tell only a fragment of the story. A single data point is a whisper, 1,000, collected over time, become a voice. The true power of the system lay not in the measurement of a single shower, but in the compilation of those measurements into something larger, a narrative of the sky, written in numbers. We are now moving from the field and the district office to the central archive, the memory palace of the state. This is where patience graduates from a seasonal vigil to a generational project. Imagine a hall within the royal precincts, cooler and drier than the outside air, purpose-built for preservation. Here, scribes who are specialists in Vashalika, rainfall accounts, perform their most important duty. They are transcribers of weather. Each year, the regional reports are copied onto more durable materials, perhaps treated palm leaf bundles, or even copper plates for vital summaries. These are bound and stored on long shelves. They aren't just filed away, they are organized chronologically and by region. What you are looking at is the birth of a climatic database. A new official, perhaps a freshly appointed superintendent of agriculture, could theoretically walk into this archive and pull the records for the Magadha region for the last 20 years. He could see patterns, that the 5th year of a certain king's reign was exceptionally dry, or that the eastern districts consistently received more late-season rain than the western ones. This practice of maintaining long-term meteorological records is a widely accepted historical fact, evidenced by references in later texts and the sheer logistical need for such data to inform the variable tax system. The state had a vested interest in remembering the weather. It allowed them to move from reaction to a crude form of prediction. If the archives showed that 3 consecutive years of below-average rainfall in a particular district had always led to a major crop failure, then when the first 2 years of low numbers came in, the state could begin preemptively moving grain reserves, much like a modern government preparing for a forecasted drought. The rain gauge data became the foundation for resource allocation and risk management on a multi-year scale. Now, here's a surprising twist that highlights their analytical mindset. They didn't just record rainfall. They correlated it. The same archives likely contained data on harvest yields, river levels, and market prices for grain. A truly insightful minister could cross-reference. He could see that a rainfall measurement of X angulars in the Vaisakha month typically led to a harvest of Y dronas of barley in District Z, which historically stabilized the market price at a certain level. This is empirical, data-driven statecraft. They were building, entry by painstaking entry, a model of their world. The amusing, very human detail here is the potential for archival frustration. You can almost picture a meticulous scribe, centuries later, unrolling a brittle scroll from a previous dynasty, squinting at the faded ink, and muttering a curse equivalent to "Did they even calibrate their pots?" The challenges of data continuity across changing regimes and measurement standards were very real. Historians still argue whether these long-term records were used for genuine climatic forecasting or solely for historical comparison and post-facto analysis. Could they predict a coming drought, or could they only confirm they were in one? The line between the two is blurry. Recognizing you are in the 3rd year of a pattern that has historically led to famine is a form of prediction, even if it lacks the specific timing of a modern 5-day forecast. The very act of preserving the data for decades, of believing that the past behavior of the monsoon held lessons for the future, was an act of profound patience and intellectual ambition. It was a declaration that the sky's whims were not entirely random, that they had rhythms which, if carefully listened to over a lifetime, over many lifetimes, might begin to be understood. In the quiet of the archive, amid the smell of old palm leaf and sandalwood preservative, the anxiety of the waiting farmer was transmuted into the quiet confidence of pattern recognition. The meticulous records in the state archive, the calibrated pots in the fields, these were not sterile, scientific pursuits divorced from the heartbeat of society. They were threads woven directly into the rich tapestry of ancient Indian culture, a culture that didn't separate time, divinity, and agriculture into neat compartments. To understand the depth of patience required by the rain gauge, we must step out of the administrative buildings and into the lived world of festivals, gods, and celestial cycles. The wait for the monsoon was not just a fiscal or agricultural countdown, it was a sacred, communal drama. You are back in the village, but the mood has shifted. The unbearable stillness of Grishma is finally breaking. Not with rain, but with anticipation. The air itself seems to crackle with a new energy. It's the month of Ashada, and the horizon no longer looks like a blank, bleached wall. Towering cumulonimbus clouds begin to build in the afternoons, great purple-bellied giants that promise everything but deliver nothing yet. This is the prelude, and culturally, It's a time of preparation and fervent hope. The rain gauge is checked with renewed, almost frantic urgency now, but the community's response to the data goes beyond the bureaucratic. If the pots remain stubbornly dry, it's not just a bad omen for the treasury, it's a signal to intensify the spiritual campaign. This is where the Vashamana meets the Vayuna. Vayuna, the god of the cosmic waters, of oaths, and of the celestial order. Rituals called Vayuna yajnas might be commissioned, with priests chanting hymns from the Rig Veda, invoking the bonds of cosmic Rita, order, to bring the rains. In more local, earthy traditions, women might sing special songs, Baramasi or Kajari, their lyrics weaving together the pain of separation from a loved one with the land's thirst for rain, blending human and agricultural longing into a single, potent metaphor. The widely accepted historical fact is that the Vedic and later Hindu calendar, Panchanga, was intrinsically tied to the agricultural and meteorological year. Festivals like Akshaya Tritiya marked the start of sowing, while Hariyali Tej celebrated the first green shoots brought by the rains. The rhythm of worship and the rhythm of the rain gauge were synchronized. Now for a lesser-known, wonderfully specific cultural detail. In some regions, there was a practice, a kind of performative meteorology, where the village astrologer, Jyotishi, would combine his astronomical charts with reports from the rain gauges. He wouldn't just look at the position of the moon in Rohini Nakshatra, a constellation believed to bring rain. He'd want to know if the pots in the eastern fields had caught anything when the moon was last there. It was a hybrid model, blending empirical observation with astrological tradition. The rain gauge data provided a ground truth check for celestial predictions. If the astrology said rain but the pot stayed dry for 3 years in a row, even the most traditional Jyotishi might start to side-eye his star charts. This pragmatic interplay between measured fact and faith is a fascinating hallmark of the system. Historians still argue whether these rituals and cultural practices were seen as causing the rain or as a form of sympathetic alignment, a way for the community to properly prepare its heart and mind, to demonstrate its worthiness and patience to the cosmos. Was it magic or psychology? For the farmer singing the Kajari song, the distinction probably didn't matter. The act of singing, of communal participation in the wait, transformed passive suffering into active devotion and shared purpose. The empty rain gauge became more than an administrative tool. It was a focal point for collective anxiety and hope, a silent participant in the songs and the smoke of the offerings. It measured not just water, but the depth of a community's patience and the height of its appeals to the heavens. In this cultural landscape, waiting was not mere inactivity. It was a sacred, seasonal occupation. The cultural rituals and the state's ledgers both point to a deeper, underlying philosophy that was being honed by the very act of watching the rain gauge. This wasn't just about managing anxiety or calculating taxes. It was cultivating a specific mindset toward time, uncertainty, and one's place in the natural order. We're moving now from the external practices to the internal landscape, from what people did while waiting to what they learned from the wait. The philosophy born from this agricultural reality was one of profound, active patience, a concept known as dhairya or sahana. Let's return to you, the farmer, in that quiet moment just before dawn, when the world is cool and grey. You walk to the field, not yet hoping for a measurement, but simply to be present. The pot is still empty. A month ago, this sight would have tightened your chest with a sharp, panic-tinged dread. But now, deep into the waiting season, something has shifted. The daily ritual has sanded down the edges of your fear. You've watched the clouds build and dissipate, seen false hopes rise and fall. The rain gauge has taught you the difference between expectation and preparedness. You don't expect rain today, but you are prepared for its absence, and for its eventual arrival. This mental shift is dhairya, steadfastness, forbearance. It's not passive resignation, It's the strength to endure uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. Your work continues, repairing tools, reinforcing irrigation channels that have lain dry for months, tending to the animals. The action continues, even as the central condition for its ultimate success remains frustratingly out of your control. This philosophy was echoed and refined in the broader intellectual traditions of the era. Thinkers observed the natural world and saw in it lessons for human conduct. The Mahabharata, that epic repository of wisdom and conflict, repeatedly extols the virtue of patience, comparing it to the oath that endures all things. A farmer who could not practice diarrhea would be destroyed by the volatility of his own hopes. The state, by institutionalizing the measurement and the weight, was essentially bureaucratizing this virtue. It was teaching its citizens, through the relentless, neutral logic of the ledger and the pot, to pace their emotional and economic expenditure across the long arc of the season, not in a single, desperate boast. The widely accepted historical fact is that agrarian life was the primary crucible for key philosophical concepts in Indian thought, with patience, cyclical time, and acceptance of natural forces being central tenets. Here's a surprising, slightly amusing philosophical detail that connects the abstract to the utterly practical. There's a concept in ancient Indian statecraft called kala, which means both time and the opportune moment. The wise ruler, like the wise farmer, was supposed to understand kala. You didn't launch a military campaign during harvest season, just as you didn't sow seeds when the rain gauge was bone dry. The rain gauge was a physical instrument for reading kala. Its emptiness was a data point screaming not yet. Its fullness was the signal for frantic, coordinated action. The philosophy of patience wasn't about doing nothing. It was about hyper-observant waiting for the precise moment when action would be most effective. It was strategic timing, calibrated by clay pots. Historians still argue whether this philosophy of patient waiting, born from agrarian dependence, reinforced a social conservatism and fatalism that could hinder technological or social innovation, or whether it provided a psychological stability that allowed civilizations to endure incredible climatic and political shocks over millennia. Was it a wisdom that fostered resilience, or a dogma that encouraged passivity? The answer likely depends on the individual and the context. For the farmer who diversifies his crops based on past rainfall data, it's resilience. For the one who simply stares at the empty pot and chants louder, it might edge toward passivity. But the system itself, with its emphasis on measurement and record-keeping, leaned toward the former. It was a philosophy rooted in observation, and observation is the first step toward understanding, and eventually, toward influence. The rain gauge, in its silent way, was a teacher of the most difficult lesson: how to be still, how to watch, and how to trust in the process of time itself, all while having a very precise, numerical way of tracking just how long that process was taking. The Mauryan Empire, for all its bureaucratic brilliance, did not last forever. Kingdoms rose and fell, dynasties changed, languages evolved. But the monsoon did not care. The need to measure it, to negotiate with it through patience and data, persisted. Our story now must leap forward through centuries, following the humble rain gauge as it travels through time, from the collapse of one great empire to the flourishing of others, and into the fractious landscape of medieval India. The pot survives, but the hands that check it and the states that rely on it transform. Imagine yourself now in a different era, perhaps in the 8th century CE, in the heart of the Rashtrakuta or the Gurjara Pratihara kingdom. You are still a farmer, and the pot in your field looks largely the same, a cylindrical earthenware vessel set flush with the earth. The principle is unchanged, but the administrative superstructure above you has shifted. The grand, centralized Mauryan model has given way to more feudal, decentralized systems. Local chieftains, temple authorities, and regional mahasamantas, great lords, now hold power. The rain gauge data is still collected, but its journey is different. Instead of traveling a long chain to a distant capital, it might go to the local Mandaleshwara's fort, or to the treasurer of a powerful temple that owns vast tracts of land. The patience is now managed on a more regional scale. The widely accepted historical fact is that the practice of rainfall measurement was not a lost Mauryan artifact. It was a sustained technological tradition. References to Vashamana appear in the writings of scholars and administrators throughout the classical and early medieval period. The Ain Ayakbari, the 16th century administrative record of the Mughal Empire, would later note detailed systems of land measurement and assessment that logically required an understanding of rainfall, suggesting a continuous thread of practice. The pot was a timeless tool because the problem was timeless. Here's a fascinating, lesser-known twist from this medieval journey. In some of the powerful South Indian kingdoms, like the Cholas, who were masters of hydraulic engineering with their massive tanks and canals, the rain gauge took on an even more precise role. It wasn't just for general land revenue. The water collected in the official rain gauge could be used to calibrate water releases from massive reservoir systems. If the gauge in a particular subbasin collected X inches, the engineers could calculate how much to supplement from the tank to ensure an even distribution for all the fields downstream. The rain gauge data became an input for complex water management, a variable in an equation of liquid logistics. This shows an evolution from measurement for assessment to measurement for active resource engineering. Historians still argue whether the systematic, empire-wide consistency of the Mauryan system degraded in the medieval period, becoming more ad hoc and localized, or whether it simply evolved into different, equally sophisticated forms suited to the political structures of the time. Did the Vashamana in a 10th century Kola village feed data into a less comprehensive but more technically advanced hydraulic system? Or was its use spottier, dependent on the interest of a local landlord? The evidence is patchier, suggesting variation was the norm. Yet, the tool itself never disappeared. Its survival is a testament to its fundamental utility. It was a piece of intellectual infrastructure so vital that it transcended the rise and fall of any single dynasty. In the courtyard of a medieval fort or by the sluice gate of a Kola tank, the ritual remained, a figure peering into a clay pot, measuring the sky's bounty or its refusal, the act itself a thread of continuity in a changing world. The weight endured, and so did the instrument that gave that weight a number. The continuity of the rain gauge tradition met a profound, and somewhat ironic, moment of rediscovery when a new wave of administrators arrived with very different ideas about science, governance, and who was capable of what. Fast forward now to the late 18th century. The setting is a district office in Bengal, perhaps under the rule of the British East India Company. You are no longer a farmer or an Indian official. You are a young, freshly arrived British civil servant, a writer for the company, tasked with understanding the land revenue system you've inherited. You sit at a heavy teak desk, sweating in your woolen coat, surrounded by piles of dusty, alien-looking records. And in these records, you keep seeing references to something called Vashamana and meticulous accounts of seasonal rainfall stretching back years, sometimes decades. Your initial reaction is likely a mixture of colonial condescension and dawning surprise. The prevailing European view of the time often painted India as a land of timeless superstition, lacking in scientific rigor. Yet here, in these meticulously kept ledgers, is evidence of sustained, quantitative environmental observation. It doesn't fit the narrative. You send a dispatch to a superior, maybe even to the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, describing this curious native practice of measuring rain with buried pots. For these British officials, many of whom were part of an Enlightenment-inspired drive to catalogue and systemize the world, the discovery was a shock. They had assumed meteorological science was a modern, European invention. To find that a sophisticated system of measurement and record-keeping had been in place for possibly over 2 millennia was a humbling, and for some, an intellectually thrilling, anomaly. This colonial encounter with India's ancient meteorological data is a widely accepted historical pivot point. It directly influenced the formal establishment of modern meteorological departments in India in the 19th century. British officials like Sir John Eliot and Henry Blandford, who helped found the India Meteorological Department, IMD, in 1875, were acutely aware of this historical precedent. They didn't start from scratch. They built upon a deep, indigenous awareness of the monsoon's importance, even as they introduced new instruments like standardized copper rain gauges and telegraph networks for faster data collection. The old earthen pot was the conceptual ancestor to the new louvered equipment. Now for the amusing, slightly ironic detail in this colonial chapter. Some of those early British officials, in their reports, expressed frustration at the variability of the native measurements. They complained about the lack of a standard gauge, and the use of local units like the angular. What they failed to grasp immediately was the reason for that variability. The system was designed for hyperlocal, agrarian assessment, not for creating a homogeneous map of rainfall across an entire subcontinent. The British goal was synoptic weather forecasting, understanding large-scale systems. The ancient Indian goal was micro-level resource management. It was a clash of meteorological philosophies. The British saw inconsistency. The Indian system saw necessary contextual specificity. The colonial officers were astonished by the existence of the data, but often blind to the nuanced logic behind its collection. Historians still argue whether the British systematization of Indian meteorology represented a genuine advancement built on native foundations or a colonial appropriation that sidelined indigenous knowledge in favor of modern science, losing valuable local nuances in the process. Did the new, precise instruments and telegraphic networks supersede the old ways, or did they simply overlay them, creating a hybrid understanding? The truth involves both. The British brought standardization and new physics, but they were forced to acknowledge that the natives had been studying their own sky with serious, applied intent for a very, very long time. In that stuffy district office, as the young civil servant puzzled over the ledger, the ancient patience encoded in its numbers quietly challenged his modern assumptions. The wait for the monsoon had just found a new, global audience. The colonial encounter set the stage for a profound and enduring paradox, one that sits at the heart of modern India's relationship with the monsoon. On one hand, you have the ancient, patient, soil-centric wisdom embodied by the Vashamana, a tool for acceptance, measurement, and local adaptation. On the other, you have the modern, urgent, physics-driven ambition of synoptic weather forecasting, a tool for prediction, control, and large-scale planning. You are now in the 20th, and bleeding into the 21st, century. India has its satellites, its Doppler radars, its supercomputers running complex atmospheric models. And yet, the monsoon remains famously, infuriatingly, difficult to predict with pinpoint accuracy. The old paradox of the rain gauge is writ large. You can measure what has fallen with great precision, but knowing what will fall, and where and when with exactitude, remains a tantalizing, elusive goal. Picture the contrast. In a field in Maharashtra, a farmer still might use a simple, unmarked pot to get a rough sense of the shower that just passed over his land, a practice passed down through generations. Simultaneously, in a sleek office in New Delhi, a scientist at the India Meteorological Department analyzes a feed from the INSAT satellite, tracking cloud formations over the Bay of Bengal, modeling pressure gradients and ocean temperatures. Both are seeking answers to the same question from utterly different worlds. The farmer's method is hyperlocal, post facto, and deeply embodied. The scientists is global, predictive, and abstract. The widely accepted fact is that despite all technological advances, the Indian monsoon is one of the most complex meteorological systems on Earth, and seasonal forecasts, while improving, still carry significant margins of error. The ancient observers, in their own way, understood this intrinsic unpredictability at the microscale, which is why their system was based on response and adaptation rather than precise, long-term prediction. This leads to a fascinating, modern-day detail that bridges the two worlds. You might be surprised to learn that some contemporary agricultural extension services and NGOs in India have revived and adapted the simple rain gauge concept. They distribute standardized, transparent plastic cylinders with centimeter markings to farmer cooperatives. The goal isn't to compete with the IMD. It's to empower the farmer with his own data. He can measure exactly how much rain fell on his plot, compare it with his neighbor's gauge a kilometer away. It can be startlingly different, and then make informed, localized decisions about irrigation, fertilizer application, or which crop variety to plant next. It's the ancient Vashamana principle, local measurement for local action, rebooted with cheap plastic and clear gradations. It marries the old patience of observation with a new agency over the data. Historians and climatologists still argue whether the fundamental approach of the ancient system, embracing variability and focusing on measured response, holds a key lesson for modern climate adaptation strategies, which often focus on ever more precise, but still uncertain, prediction. In an era of climate change, where historical patterns are becoming less reliable, is there wisdom in designing systems that are robust to a range of rainfall outcomes, much like the variable tax system of the Mauryans, rather than betting everything on a single forecast? The debate is alive. The modern technological drive seeks to dissolve uncertainty with information. The ancient philosophical drive sought to build resilience within uncertainty. The farmer with his plastic gauge is doing both. He checks the IMD app on his phone for the broad forecast, then walks to his field to measure the reality on the ground. He lives the paradox, using all tools at his disposal, old and new, to navigate the eternal, patient wait for the sky's decision. So where does this leave us, after this journey from earthen pots to orbiting satellites? It leaves us at a crossroads of understanding, where the story of the rain gauge ceases to be just about meteorology or history and becomes a mirror for a fundamental human tension, our relationship with time and uncertainty. The ancient Indian approach, crystallized in that simple pot, wasn't merely a technical solution. It was a cultural and philosophical framework for living in a world where the most vital things are often beyond your control. You are, right now, in your own life, waiting for something, an answer, an outcome, a change. The rain gauge's lesson is about how to wait. Think about the structure it imposed. First, it mandated observation. You didn't just fret about the lack of rain, you went and checked the pot. This simple act externalized the anxiety. It turned an internal, swirling dread into an external, measurable fact. The pot is empty is a cleaner, calmer thought than everything is doomed. Second, it fostered ritual. The daily or weekly check became a habit, a touchstone. Rituals tame time, breaking an amorphous, stressful period into manageable, repeated segments. Third, it enabled record keeping. This shifted the perspective from the present agony to the longer pattern. One dry week in a history of data is a blip. 4 dry weeks is a trend. The record provided context, the antidote to present moment panic. Finally, it informed prepared action. The data didn't lead to paralysis. It led to calculated decisions, to hold seed, to mobilize grain, to adjust taxes. The wait was filled with purposeful activity, not passive despair. This framework is the widely applicable, psychological insight embedded in the historical fact. Whether you're waiting for test results, for a career breakthrough, or for a personal conflict to resolve, the principles hold. Observe the situation clearly, without melodrama. Establish a simple ritual to manage the obsessive checking of your mental pot. Keep a record of your observations. A journal can be your ledger, to see patterns and gain perspective. And finally, based on the best data you have, take the preparatory actions you can control. The ancient system bureaucratized hope and fear into manageable processes. Now, for a lighter, reflective detail. In a way, our modern digital lives are both the zenith and the antithesis of the rain gauge philosophy. We have endless pots to check, email notifications, social media likes, news feeds, stock tickers, each one a tiny vessel we peer into for a drop of validation or information. But these pots give us data without context, measurement without purpose, and they demand checking on a timescale of milliseconds, not seasons. They cultivate impatience, not diarrhea. The ancient rain gauge was checked slowly, physically, with the whole body present in the field. Its data had a direct, life-sustaining meaning. Our digital gauges often have no such connection, making us data-rich but patience-poor. Historians and sociologists still argue whether the acceleration of information flow in the digital age has made us fundamentally incapable of the kind of deep, seasonal patience that agrarian societies cultivated, or whether we simply need to develop new cultural rituals and measurement tools suited to our own era's uncertainties. The rain gauge asks us to consider what we are measuring, why we are measuring it, and what the appropriate interval for that measurement should be. It suggests that some of the most important things in life cannot be rushed, only observed, recorded, and met with prepared resilience. The pot in the field was an anchor in time, a tool that taught an entire civilization to breathe with the slow rhythm of the clouds. In our world of instant updates, that lesson in measured waiting feels not just ancient, but urgently, deeply necessary. We've seen the gauge as a tool of the state, a focus of culture, a spark for philosophy, and a mirror for our modern minds. Now, let's pull the lens to its widest angle. The story of the ancient Indian rain gauge is, in its quiet way, a story about the human species' long, slow conversation with the planet. It's an early, elegant example of our attempt to listen to the earth, to quantify its processes, and to find our place within them, not as masters, but as attentive participants. This final leg of our journey is about legacy, about the faint but indelible watermark this system has left on our collective understanding of our home. Imagine for a moment a timeline of environmental science. On one end, you have intuitive, myth-based explanations for natural phenomena. On the other, you have the complex, instrument-driven climatology of today. The Vashamana sits firmly in the middle, representing a pivotal transition. It marks the moment a society decided to replace, or at least supplement, the gods are withholding rain with the pot shows a depth of 2 angulars this week. It's a shift from purely narrative understanding to narrative informed by empirical data. This shift is a widely accepted cornerstone in the history of science. While other ancient civilizations, like the Greeks and Chinese, also made meteorological observations, the systemic, state-integrated, and quantitative nature of the Indian approach, particularly as codified in the Arthashastra, gives it a unique place in the annals of environmental monitoring. The legacy, however, is subtle. You won't find many modern textbooks that start the history of meteorology with Kautilya. The Western narrative often jumps from Aristotle to the Renaissance. But the influence is there in the conceptual DNA of how we think about resource management. The idea that a government should collect environmental data to inform economic policy and disaster preparedness? That's pure Arthashastra. The notion of creating a long-term archive of weather data to detect climatic patterns? The Mauryan scribes were binding those palm leaf ledgers. Here's a surprising, macro-scale detail. When modern climatologists work with proxy data to reconstruct past climates, using tree rings, ice cores, or sediment layers, they are engaging in the same essential practice as those ancient record keepers. They are looking for measurable, physical evidence of past environmental conditions. The rain gauge was a deliberate, human-created proxy, a way of inscribing the weather's passage into the administrative record. In that sense, those old Vashalika ledgers, if any had survived the tropical climate, would be priceless troves of proxy data for historical climatology today. Historians of science still argue whether the Indian rain gauge tradition directly influenced the development of meteorological science in the Islamic world or early modern Europe, or whether it was an independent, parallel innovation that underscores a universal human response to a fundamental need. Given the trade routes and the transmission of knowledge, especially mathematics and astronomy, from India to the Arab world and beyond, some indirect influence is plausible, but difficult to prove. Its greater legacy may be as a paradigm case, a clear historical example that measuring the environment for societal benefit is not a modern invention, but a very old and sophisticated human impulse. It reminds us that the drive to understand our climate is not new. It is ancient, urgent, and born from the very real need to survive and thrive within its rhythms. So, the next time you see a weather report on a screen, with its animated clouds and percentage chances, remember it descends from a lineage that includes a clay pot buried in red earth. That pot represents a choice: to face the vast, intimidating uncertainty of nature not with mere superstition or blind fear, but with a simple tool, a steady gaze, and the patience to record the results over a lifetime, and over generations. It was an act of humility and of profound ambition. The ambition wasn't to control the weather, but to understand one's place within it, and to build a society resilient enough to wait for its bounty, measure its scarcity, and endure its tests. And so, we arrive at the end of our measurement. We've traveled from the sun-baked fields of the Gangetic Plains to the glow of modern satellite maps, all following the thread of a simple idea: that to wait wisely, you must first learn to measure. The ancient Indian rain gauge, that englazed pot level with the earth, was more than an instrument. It was a teacher of patience, a pillar of the state, a focal point for prayer, and a quiet revolution in how humans observe their world. Its story is not one of dramatic conquest or sudden discovery, but of gradual, persistent accretion, of data, of understanding, of resilience. Like the monsoon it measured, its impact was slow, pervasive, and life-giving. You are no longer in any historical scene. You are here, in the quiet of your own space, the narrative settling around you like fine dust after a long journey. The tension of the waiting farmer, the scratch of the scribe's stylus, the astonishment of the colonial officer, these echoes fade into a softer, broader realization. The challenge those ancient societies faced, the struggle to align human time with nature's time, to balance the urgency of need with the slow unfolding of natural cycles, is not a relic. It is the fundamental condition of our existence, merely dressed in different clothes. We still wait. We wait for seasons of our lives to change, for projects to bear fruit, for answers to arrive. The Vashamana offers a timeless metaphor: find your gauge. Find that simple, honest tool that allows you to observe your situation clearly, without illusion. Let it ground your anxiety in fact. Let its routine steady your pulse. And let its long record remind you that this moment, however dry or full, is part of a pattern larger than your immediate fear or hope. The philosophy of patient waiting, of diarrhea, cultivated by millennia of watching the sky and measuring its gifts, whispers that there is strength in the pause, wisdom in the interval, and agency in the prepared mind. It suggests that our most profound progress is often not a frantic leap forward, but the capacity to be still, to observe meticulously, and to act in harmony with rhythms we did not create and cannot ultimately hurry. In a world that venerates speed and instant gratification, this ancient lesson feels like a deep, calming breath. It is the understanding that some of the most important things, rain, trust, healing, growth, cannot be forced, only welcomed when they finally, in their own good time, arrive. The imagery of the field, the pot, the ledger, all begins to soften now, losing its sharp edges and vibrant colors, dissolving into the gentle haze of memory. The voices of the farmers, the scribes, the ministers, blend into a distant, harmonious murmur, like the sound of wind through a vast, timeless forest. The numbers in the ledgers, once so urgent, fade from stark black ink to a faint, gray watermark on the page of history. The clay of the pot crumbles slowly back into the earth from which it came, completing the circle. The satellite eye view of the swirling clouds melts into a blanket of stars over a quiet, slumbering land. All that remains is the feeling it leaves behind, a sense of deep, quiet continuity. The same moon that shone on the Mauryan official checking his records shines on you now. The same human hope for a tomorrow watered by grace persists. The struggle is ancient, but so is the resilience. The wait is long, but so is the memory of past rains, and the faith in rains to come. Let the meticulousness of their observations soothe your own scattered thoughts. Let their institutional patience calm your personal urgency. They measured the rain drop by drop, season by season, generation by generation, and in doing so, they measured out a form of courage that is not loud, but enduring, not quick, but unshakable. So, as the last of this story seeps into the soil of your mind, allow your own questions, your own weights, to become a little lighter. You are part of a long lineage of watchers and waiters. You need not hold your breath. You need only remember the pot in the field, and the simple, profound act of looking, of noting, and of trusting that even the longest drought is, in the grand turn of the wheel, only a pause. A pause before the green returns. A pause before the air cools. A pause before the next chapter begins. Now, let the silence after the story be as deep and peaceful as the patience it described. Let everything gentle itself into rest.